Hello everyone, it's me Josephine Sneha. Hope you're all doing well. In this video, I'm going to summarize a critical work called as Apology for Poetry written by Philip Sidney. So to begin with the authorial note, Philip Sidney is a poet, scholar, courtier and a critic of course. Well, he is considered to be a fine gentleman and he was like well read and he has voracious knowledge about the things happening during the Elizabethan period or the Renaissance age, and he was like interacting with so many people and there were so many interesting things happening in his life which he tried to incorporate in the works he wrote, which is why often people love to read his biography compared to the books. Speaking of the critical work, the Apology for Poetry, it is also generally called as Defense of Poesy. It is considered to be the finest and the first critical work written in English literature. So this work is actually a response to what Stephen Gosson wrote in a pamphlet called as School of Abuse. So Stephen Gosson is a person filled with puritanical thoughts. So at the time, they believed that poetry was meant to entertain. So these Puritans were strictly against anything that was about to entertain people. So Stephen Gosson kind of abused or had a bad opinion about poetry in this pamphlet called as School of Abuse. So Philip Sidney, who was a poet at the time, read it, got offended, and he thought like, let me defend it. So that is how this work called Apology for Poetry was born. So this is a short introductory note about this. So let's get into it, shall we? To begin with, well, Philip Sidney is well aware that any work of art is an imitation of nature. So whatever is happening in reality, the poet or anyone, they observe, they actually try to get it within them and then they finally replicate it in the work of art. So this is what is happening. So they are trying to show what is happening in the reality only. In that case, there is two results. One is they'll be entertained and there will be education, of course. He says that virtuous learning is the end product of education. So any person reading poetry will also get educated and this will be replicated when they act in the society. So that is what Philip Sidney is trying to say. So as said earlier, Stephen Gosson is kind of like abusing poetry in his pamphlet called as School of Abuse. So he actually charges 4 things on poetry. One is that it is a waste of time. Second one is it is a mother of lies. Third one is it is a nurse of abuse. And fourth one is Plato rightly banished poets from his ideal state or ideal country. So these are the 4 charges which Stephen Gosson keeps on poetry. So Philip Sidney actually is well aware of it and he now tries to answer everything that is given by Stephen Gosson. So these are the 4 things that has to be kept in mind. So first thing is poetry is a waste of time. So Stephen Gosson attacks saying it's a waste of time, but Philip Sidney defends saying that how can one call poetry to be a waste of time, because the aim of poetry is also to teach. Not only that, he gives classical examples where the Greek people considered these poets to be closer to God. Only people who were like gifted or blessed by God, they were able to write poetry and they were able to tell prophecy. In that case, they predicted the future stuffs and etc. So they were like worshipped somewhere like closer to God. So in that case, they should not be disrespected. So whatever they write, it is not considered as a waste of time. Not only that, poet of course amuses. There is no difference of opinion. The poetry of course amuses, it entertains people, but at the same time it educates. It is a mode of communication. The poet is actually communicating with the readers. Whatever he saw in the reality, whatever he's seeing in the nature, he's actually conveying. So it's a mode of communication. It is also a main form of gaining or improving our knowledge. So in that case, Philip says whatever Stephen Gosson said, it's wrong. It's not a waste of time because we are learning so much here. Apart from amusement, there is a lot of learning process going on. Second thing Stephen says is poetry is a mother of lies, for which Philip Sidney says that of course like poet is not exactly lying. There is actually a blend of truth and fiction. So whatever is seen in natural or in nature is actually raw, unfiltered, and there are ugly realities of course. So whatever we are seeing it, instead of replicating the same way, they are trying to beautify it, they are justifying it, that's it. So it actually kind of motivates people, it inspires people, and of course it amuses people. So he says that one cannot blame poetry to be entirely a mother of lies. Of course there is a blend of truth and fiction. Of course we learn facts also from poetry, just like history. Even poetry tried to tell us the facts, but at the same time the poets wants to give a kind of an imaginative state which they cannot see it in reality, or they help the people to see something unreal or something fantastic so that they'll actually get inspired and they'll feel happy if at all they don't get the same feeling while facing it in reality. So that is what they do. So they are kind of elevating whatever is present in the reality. Third thing Stephen says is, it is a nurse of abuse. Sidney kind of completely rejects it. Even the earlier point, Mother of Life, he says, of course, there are lies in the poetry, which is a kind of like a fiction and anything. But here he completely disagrees, because he states that there are people like Stephen Gosson, of course, they actually abuse the poets and the poetry, but then poetry doesn't abuse anybody. He says that if in fact he should blame anything to be a source of abuse, it should be history and philosophy, which actually Stephen Gosson exaggerates or keeps it in the pedestal. So they are the ones actually is a nurse of abuse or something that promotes abuse. But instead here, because they actually show bloodshed, war, battle, hypocrisy, conspiring, everything that is happening. But whereas poetry, they do not do that. Instead, they promote harmony, morality, because we have something called as poetic justice in literature, right? The virtue to be rewarded and the vice to be punished. So whereas history or philosophy doesn't teach it. So poetry actually doesn't promote abuses. Instead, it is completely away. It promotes harmony and peace. So he says it's like completely fake, whatever Stephen Gosson says, and the blame should be on history and philosophy, which he is actually exaggerating or keeping it in a high pedestal, of course. And the fourth point about Plato's banishing of the poets from the ideal state. So Sidney says that the Plato who says that the poets should be banished, he himself was a poet. So he himself was not free from writing poetry. His famous The Dialogues, the work, it is a completely poetical work. So Plato's idea or notion was entirely different at that time, because the youth and everyone at that time, they were actually like reading poetry, and they were like amused, they were completely intoxicated, not doing anything productive to the society. So Plato wants to blame only those kind of poets. He says that like whichever poets who fails to instruct the children or instruct the youth, who are the pillars of the future society, they should be banished, not the ones who does both instruction and also amuse. Because like, of course, the entire notion of literature is to give amusement, but at the same time there should be some point, some value to be conveyed. So that is what Plato meant to say. He says that he does not want to banish everybody at the time. Instead, those who did not instruct the children, but their only notion was to keep amusing without no further value. So that is what Sidney is actually telling. And Sidney further states that any artists or any poets, they'll be able to produce any work of art or literature based on what their readers expect. So they belong to Renaissance era, which actually believed in both education and entertainment, delight and instruction. In that case, the poets at that time, that is what they were giving, of course. In that case, Stephen Gosson, with the Puritan mindset, he cannot completely abuse or completely sidetrack poetry, stating that it is completely waste of time or completely nursing abusal or anything. So he states that any work of art produced at a particular period, it is done based on the needs and the interest of the particular audience or the particular readers. And he says that any poet, they actually strongly stick to the point that virtue is rewarded and the vice is punished. So that is the poetic justice, right? So that is what they stick to. So in that case, people are definitely learning something, and they also apply it. And not only that, he also touches upon the example of philosophy in history, because Stephen Gosson actually justifies it to be the best. Here, Philip Sidney says that history uses examples or to prove something with the examples of concrete images, whereas philosophy proves something or speaks about something through abstract images. But whereas poetry, it tries to blend both, because we have historical poems, we have philosophical poems as well. So it tries to blend it and give it in such a way that it reaches the audience or the readers, and they are able to think, ponder and also act upon it. So in that case, poetry is the best thing. So he doesn't actually throw dirt upon history and philosophy. It was Stephen who did it. But he says that this is the ultimate reality. So in that case, poetry is better because it teaches good to the audience. So nature, which is dull and ugly and filled with ugly realities, so the poet or any writer actually fills it with an imaginative element and they present it. So that is what is the blend of both. And also we have facts and figures, just like history, in poetry as well. So through that also the readers are gaining much knowledge. And also Philip Sidney ends this work by stating different kinds of poetry present, like we have lyric, elegy, ballad, etc. So out of which he considers epic to be the best form of poetry, because epic, of course, like run for so many pages, and it talks about the heroic deeds committed by a hero. And here there is like a vast amount of platform which is given to tell the story of the hero. But whereas, like, of course, like within the other forms of poetry, there isn't much space to tell the story or teach a lesson. But with the epic, they can tell this heroic deed about the hero, his downfall, his upliftment, his way of mending nature, and when things go wrong, the divine intervention, everything, and poetic justice, of course. So everything is like comes in a full cycle when it comes when it comes to epic. Thus, Philip Sidney successfully answers all the charges against poetry given by Stephen Gosson. Not only Stephen Gosson, even other puritanical people had the same mindset, of course. They were against poetry. So he answers all of it and stands for the pure purpose of poetry, that it stands for the universal quality of promoting education and entertainment at the same time. So he says that the pure notion of poetry is not something like what Stephen says, not lying, not promoting abuse or anything. Instead, it wants people to gain knowledge and encourage and enrich themselves so that they maintain a proper harmony in the world. So that's all in this critical work. So we'll meet in some other video. Until that, stay safe and make healthy choices. Bye.